Easter dinner at my grandmother's house has always felt like a quiet competition dressed up as tradition. Nothing dramatic, nothing openly said, but you could feel it in the way people listened, in the way they asked questions, in the pauses between answers. This year, though, something shifted in a way I didn't expect, and it started with a single sentence that changed how everyone at that table saw me. I arrived a little early, like I always do, stepping into a house that smelled exactly the same as it had every spring of my life. The baked ham was already in the oven, filling the air with a warmth that clung to everything, from the curtains to the old wooden cabinets. The dining table was stretched afar for the room, packed with mismatched chairs, as if the house itself had to adjust to fit all of us. My name is Ethan, and for most of my life, I have been the harder one to explain. Not because I lacked direction, but because my work never sounded impressive in a single sentence. My younger brother, Daniel, never had that problem. He worked at a major tech company, the kind people recognized instantly, and he spoke about his job in a way that made it sound like he was building the future with his bare hands. Growing up, it was always like this. Daniel would talk, and people would lean in. I would talk, and people would nod politely before changing the subject. Over time, I learned to keep things simple. When relatives asked what I did, I would say I worked with infrastructure software and partnerships. It was accurate, but vague enough to end the conversation quickly. By the time everyone had arrived, the house was buzzing with noise. My cousins argued about sports, my uncles debated the economy, and my grandmother moved quietly between rooms, observing everything without saying much. Then Daniel walked in, about 30 minutes late, like someone who knew his entrance mattered. He greeted everyone with easy confidence and slid into his seat like he owned the moment. Not long after, he started telling a story about a project at work. He described tight deadlines, underperforming teammates, and how he had to step in to keep everything on track. His voice carried just enough authority to make people listen closely, even when they didn't fully understand what he was saying. I kept my focus on my plate, letting the conversation flow around me like it always did. At some point, the topic shifted to layoffs in the tech world. One of my uncles mentioned a neighbor's son who had recently lost his job, and the tone of the table turned slightly more serious. Daniel leaned back in his chair, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and spoke with a calm confidence that filled the space. He said that not everyone was cut out for a real career in tech. He did not look at me when he said it, but he didn't need to. The implication was clear, hanging in the air just long enough for a few quiet chuckles to follow. I kept my expression neutral, staring down at my plate, because I had been here before. The truth was, this had been the most demanding year of my life. For months, I had been buried in late-night calls, complex negotiations, and endless revisions of financial models. I had worked with legal teams across multiple time zones, navigating deals that fell apart and came back together again. None of it looked impressive from the outside, but it had consumed nearly every waking hour of my life. Dinner moved forward, as it always does. Plates were passed, glasses refilled, and conversations drifted from one topic to another. Then my grandmother, who had been quietly observing everything, turned her head slightly and looked directly at me. Her voice was calm, almost casual, as if she were asking about the weather. She asked if that was why my company had just bought his. For a brief moment, I thought I had misunderstood her. The table didn't explode into silence, but it paused just enough to feel different. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and several people turned to look at me. Daniel blinked, clearly caught off guard, and asked what she meant. My grandmother shrugged gently and said she had heard something from a friend's grandson who worked in finance. She mentioned an acquisition and said she thought it involved my company and Daniel's. The room grew still in a quieter, more focused way, like everyone was waiting for a piece of information to land. I felt an unusual shift, like two separate parts of my life were suddenly colliding. The world I had been working in for months, full of contracts and confidential discussions, was now stepping into the small dining room. I kept my voice steady and said that the deal had closed last week. That was all I said. No explanation, no build-up, just a simple statement. One of my uncles leaned forward, trying to process it, and asked if I meant my company had acquired another. I nodded once. Daniel had already pulled out his phone, scrolling quickly, his expression still calm but starting to change in subtle ways. He checked one thing, then another, as if expecting to prove something different. But the information was there, waiting for him. The color in his face shifted slightly, not into embarrassment, but into something more controlled, like someone recalculating their understanding of a situation. Around the table, people were beginning to connect the dots. My cousin Emily whispered something under her breath, and the energy in the room quietly transformed. Daniel looked up at me and asked what my role was in all of it. I told him I had been part of the leadership group that handled the negotiations. I didn't emphasize it or try to make it sound bigger than it was. I simply stated the truth as it existed. No one laughed this time. No one made a joke or tried to redirect the moment. The weight of what I said didn't come from how I delivered it, but from the fact that it was already done. The deal had been signed, the companies had merged, and decisions had been made far beyond this table. Daniel leaned back in his chair, quieter now. He still spoke occasionally for the rest of dinner, but his tone had changed. It wasn't defeat, just a noticeable shift, like someone realizing they had been working with an outdated version of reality. The conversation eventually found safer ground again, and dessert was served as if nothing unusual had happened. Later, I stood in the kitchen stacking plates, letting the noise from the dining room fade into the background. My grandmother walked in behind me, drying her hands on a towel. She looked at me with a small, knowing smile and said she had always suspected my work was more important than I made it sound. I smiled back and told her I had never seen the point in explaining it. She nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense, and returned to the table without another word. I stayed there for a moment longer, listening to Daniel's voice drift in from the other room, softer now, more measured as he spoke with our uncle. What surprised me most was how I felt. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. The deal I had worked on had taken nearly a year of effort, and compared to that, this moment at the dinner table felt small. It was just a ripple from something much larger that had already happened. But something had changed, and it wasn't just how others saw me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to explain myself or compete for attention in that room. The quiet comparison that had always existed at that table no longer held the same weight. The room hadn't changed, the people hadn't changed, but somehow I had, and that made all the difference.